Children's sermons are here to stay. They're not going to go away from the churches that use them. And that's okay. I think most pastors and even most congregants have a love-hate relationship with children's sermons. I think it's important for a lot of churches that something be done that recognizes, hey, there are little people here among us, and they're part of this congregation. In a lot of churches, you can go through a service, and it seems like nobody recognizes the fact that anybody is there under the age of 40. So they're there. The bad part, of course, is that they're sometimes condescending. They are sometimes the only means by which children are recognized in a service. So there's always a problem with integrating them. I think there are things that a preacher can do to help. One is the preacher needs to be involved in giving the children's sermon. It can't be something that's always shunted off onto the children's ministry director or somebody else. Doesn't mean it always has to happen. It's like the pastor always has to be the one who delivers that message, but there should be some connection there. I think, too, you shouldn't ask the children questions if you already have the answer and you're going to trump the answer at the end, right? Where you say, hey, what does everybody think about X? And then they give their 10 answers, some of which are hilarious. And then you give the right answer and keep going. You can't preach to the adults over the children, right? This is, of course, a familiar mistake that's made where it's clear the pastor is addressing the adults in the congregation by means of the children. And I know a lot of kids who see right through that. I've heard children before say to me, why go forward for the children's sermon? They're just talking to you anyway. So these are my children, but who don't like going forward for the children's sermon. They perceive something there. They notice something about that. So I want to take that seriously. I think instead of a bunch of do nots, what can you do? One thing is think about how in the children's sermon you can prep or prime the children, assuming they stay in worship after the children's sermon, prep or prime them to look for things in worship, look for things in the sermon to follow. So that help them see that there's more to come and say, later I'm going to read a story. It's about two brothers and their father, the parable of the prodigal son. I want you to listen and think about, what does each one do wrong or something like that, so that they go, okay, now I've got to pay attention. Or say, in the sermon, I'm going to talk about ways in which we need to trust God in our lives or something like that, or things that make it hard for us to trust God. I want you to start thinking between now and then how it's hard for you to trust somebody, and give some illustrations. But that way they're thinking, when the sermon comes, oh, this is the part he told me about, she told me about. I've got to be ready to hear this. So it makes them a little more attentive, and they're able to hear things. Just as in the quote-unquote regular sermon or the adult sermon, whatever, right? There is reference back to the children's sermon. So it's not seen as a tangent to worship, but as part of the flow and part of what's going on. That's one way you can make it more integral to what's happening. That puts pressure on the preacher then when preaching to think about people from all different stages of life, right? And so all of the examples shouldn't be cancer diagnosis, lost job, ailing parent. I mean, all of these things are of course real, but they wash over the heads of a 7 or 8-year-old. How can you also talk about the woes of life or the blessings of life that matter for a school-age child, for an adolescent, somebody in college, the elderly, the divorced, the married, and to vary that when you go through your litany of woes or your litany of blessings in your sermon, so that people hear the sermon or the children's sermon and say, she knows something, he knows something, the preacher does, about my life, right? And I hear it reflected here in the worship service. The children's sermon shouldn't be exempt from that, nor should it be the only place where children hear that.